In chapter 13, we have the third major discourse in Matthew. And if you skip on to verse 53, you can see the familiar transitional sentence which indicates that this was one of the five. All three synoptic gospels have the parable of the sower, so it must be reckoned as one of the more significant parables. It is, however, misnamed because it is not much about the sower, but about the four soils. Following the last two chapters, which featured much unbelief and opposition, this parable goes some way to explaining the different reactions to the gospel. Worth noting also is that this is an allegorical parable. This means that each feature is a symbol and needs to be decoded. For example, the birds represent satanic activity. Very few of Jesus' parables are like this, and we will see another one in this chapter. When you do have these parables, we find that Jesus will decode them for his disciples in private, which is what we see in verses 18 to 30. The parables are extraordinary compositions, small tales or illustrations which are dramatic and vivid, yet simple and memorable. The ones which are stories are particularly involving, and the listener is impacted by a surprising twist at the end, followed by some summary or challenge by Jesus. They often contain 3 or 4 characters or groups of characters, which are often characterized as wise and foolish, rich and poor, slave and master, etc. The parables are designed to engage the listener with everyday knowledge and situations and take them on a conceptual journey, like a bridge from one place to another. They are used mainly to illustrate different facets of the kingdom. But there is also a deeper prophetic significance to the parables. They also function to fulfill Isaiah's prophecy about listening but never hearing, seeing and never understanding. To those on the outside, the parables are interesting, but the secrets of the meaning are only for those on the inside. Thus, whilst the parable of the soils explains the different reactions, at a more mysterious level, unbelief is somehow connected to prophecy. Despite the open and earnest proclamation and all the miracles, the knowledge of the kingdom remains a secret. The parable of the wheat and the tares, or weeds, is found only in Matthew's Gospel, and is the other allegorical parable I mentioned. It too has a private explanation. The parable illustrates the uncomfortable problem already mentioned in chapter 7, which is the false disciples and prophets amongst the true people of God. There may be many among Israel, as John the Baptist challenged, who think that they are of the people of God, but there will come a day when the Son of Man will send out his angels to expose who is real and who is false. In the explanation in verse 42, Jesus uses again the grim phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth. He used it earlier in chapter 8, verse 12. He uses it a third time here in chapter 13 in verse 50. In total, he will use it 6 times in his gospel, compared to Luke, who only uses it once, and Mark and John not at all. Matthew's gospel has a particular emphasis on judgment and the sorting out of all things. We see this again in verses 47 to 50, which is another parable unique to Matthew, where again the angels sort out the mix of the good and the bad at the end of the age. These parables are not just about judgment, but about revelation too. God will find out who really belongs to him or not. Again, the judgment scene in 7:21 to 23 illustrates this. In verse 43, however, he says the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. This is a reference to Daniel 12:3, which occurs in other Jewish writings to describe the blessed condition of the righteous after death. Other parables describe the kingdom itself. There is a parable about its growth from small beginnings, another about its pervasiveness, and 2 similar ones which describe how someone would be willing to give up everything if they found something sufficiently valuable. Lastly, Matthew provides another fulfillment quotation in verses 34 to 35, taken from Psalm 78. This one shows that Jesus' mode of parabolic speech is part of his scriptural fulfillment, And unlike the previous scriptural quotation, which is shared by Mark and Luke, it is not about whether people believe him or not.